What's up, everybody? This is Peter X Coffer, and welcome to another episode of Level Up, the personal branding video show. And today we're doing the one and only Jimi Hendrix. Hey, you can see I'm rocking the jacket. We went from 70 degrees to I think the highs will be in the low 40s, 30s, and mid 30s for this week. So we kind of jumped from spring to late fall, and literally one day we had snow 2 days ago, and last week I was walking around with no jacket on. But hey, it's Indiana weather for you. So Jimi Hendrix, one of my all-time favorites. He came up through the Chitlin circuit. He played with Little Richard and the Isley Brothers, and the famous story was he was playing on stage with Little Richard, and the crowd was going crazy. And Little Richard thought it was him until he looked over, and there was Jimmy playing with his teeth. And Little Richard's like, "Nope, I'm the star here. Mr. Hendrix, you gotta go." And I don't know how long he lasted with Little Richard. I don't think it was a month. But yeah, that didn't last very long. Little Richard was not going to be outshined by anybody. Um, you know, Jimi Hendrix was a blues guitarist in a rock era, in the era of Motown, when blues was no longer, I mean, essentially he was a blues guitarist, when blues was waning. The history of blues commercially, they didn't really chart a lot. I don't think they're basically singles. You know, they never, blues didn't stick around long enough to have quote unquote blues concept albums. So, by the time, Hendrix is, his the scene in '67 with his first album. Blues is a old folks genre, and I kind of feel that way too because here I am, hip hop's dominant, and I'm a funk guy. 50 years too late, I guess, but hey, whatever. So Jimmy actually had to leave the U.S. and go to London. The racial politics at the time. And obviously, he hit the scene in London within a week. He was on stage and playing and became the talk of London. The Stones, the Beatles, the Who, everybody. Eric Clapton, and there's the famous story of Eric Clapton freaking out the first time he ever saw Jimmy play because people were spray painting Clapton's God around on buildings in London, and here comes Jimi Hendrix and just literally lights the place on fire. So yeah, Jimmy grew up poor. And when I say poor, Jimmy was dirt poor. I mean, of the musicians I've looked at, I think Jimmy was the poorest. I mean, he, his dad, he, was with his dad most of his life. His mom was around at times, but she passed when Jimmy was young, and literally they were living in I don't know if flop house is the word, but literally rooms where you pay by the week, in Seattle, Washington. So he was very, very poor. Matter of fact, when he started playing the guitar, he would pawn his guitar off, figure out how to make money to go buy it back from the pawn shop, and he did this multiple times. And I think his first guitar didn't even have all the strings. I mean, it was missing strings, and he didn't get which is amazing. Look at the player he was. But Jimmy, took that guitar everywhere he went, and he didn't really get a professional guitar. Even a decent guitar. I don't know what he was playing back then, but he didn't, until I think Keith Richards' girlfriend or wife, Keith Richards of the Stones, got him his first, Strat, and of course, Jimmy's known for his Fender Stratocasters, but it took a while, for him to get that and where he could actually hang on to one. So Jimmy, left Seattle, went on the road, and then ends up in the mid '60s in uh, New York City, and then goes to Greenwich Village and ends up in Harlem. And then one of the members of the Animals, I want to say it was Chaz Chandler, was discovered him and took him to England because he felt Jimmy would have a better chance of breaking in England. Of course, that's exactly what happened, and I don't know, within a couple months in England, he was a sensation, and he got signed, and Are You Experienced, everything, the rest is history. Came back to the U.S. with the Monterey Pop Festival. What a entrance back home. I mean, he that's the, there's the famous picture of Jimmy, talking to the guitar, doing the voodoo stuff, and flames coming out of the guitar. That was his first trip back, into the U.S. as a headlining act, and it just blew people's mind. And there's the famous story. Um, I think it was a coin flip. Who was gonna go on first, the Who or Hendrix? Because Pete Townsend and Jimi Hendrix both liked to smash their guitars, and the Who knew if um, they didn't want to follow Jimi Hendrix. And Jimmy won that, and so the Who had to go on after Jimi Hendrix after he burned the guitar, and Pete Townsend wasn't real happy, but hey, two legends. Pete's a legend in his own right, and it's just kind of funny how that played out. Another legendary, obviously, the Star Spangled Banner from Woodstock. So you know, as far to me, the still jaw dropping to this day for me is I mean, Wild Thing. That's the last song in the Monterey Pop Festival set where he burns, he smashes and burns the guitar. Then Star Spangled Banner, and then Band of Gypsies. Who knows? And uh, Machine Gun, and that's the first side of the vinyl. And it was a longer um, concert, and I think he did two concerts that night, if I'm not mistaken. And when he after he passed, they ended up releasing both of them. But you know, while he was alive, it was just that one, and I can listen to those four songs I just named from Hendrix, still to this day, and just awed by his playing power. Just some amazing stuff. I trying to figure out Hendrix for years, and I've come to the conclusion that he was a guitarist. He looked at the guitar as an instrument, but also as a special effects machine, for lack of a better word. Because he did things with the guitar that no guitarist had, since or before. I mean, he just expanded the musical range of that instrument. In very, very, very creative ways. So, I mean, Jimi Hendrix is a legend. So, Jimmy's brand. Uh, well, he wore some really flashy clothes early on. He got into the buying into old military garb when he was in London. So, you know, not current military uniforms. And interestingly enough, in the early '90s, Michael got into that military kind of look too. But Jimmy was the first, and obviously Jimmy did the Flower Child stuff, and then of course, I mean, how he played the guitar, not just what, but with his teeth behind his head, between his legs, behind his back. Um, Jimmy was just a force of nature. When it came to playing, he really put on the show. And it's interesting. I quote Rick Beato a lot. And usually agree with him. I have to disagree, and you can go check out. He Beato did I think this year 2022, if not it was 2021, and the title of it is 10-15 minutes. If Jimi Hendrix came up today, would he be a star? And Beato argues no because the stuff on the radio is not guitar driven, and my thing is, I mean, have you seen those Hendrix, you know, videos of him back in the day? I mean, Jimmy might, uh, bring the guitar back, with the playing with the teeth and behind the head and all that other stuff. So I disagree with Beato on that a little. I think because he was such an amazing performer, and when you look at the rock genre, I mean. He may be the best. I mean, the Stones are very good, but they're not as flamboyant. I mean, Mick Jagger has a bunch of energy, and you know, late in the run, Jim Morrison, the Doors, they got into a little bit of performance theater that got Jim in trouble in Miami. But that's another episode because I'm doing Jim Morrison and the Doors. But so yeah, I mean, Jimmy had to look, but Jimmy was a great lyricist and he was a great songwriter. With the metaphors, Voodoo Child and The Wind Cries Mary. I mean, Mary, that biblical, thing going in there, and he was a underrated lyricist. I've dropped great lyricists, in some of my other episodes. I always talk Lennon and Dylan and Prince and Kurt Cobain, but Jimmy's right there with those guys. He's right there, and Ice Cube, Nas, but Jimmy's there too. I mean, he's very underrated. And Jimmy did not like his singing voice at all, but he sang with passion, and he sang with. I mean, you could feel it. And back then you had to have a certain tone of voice, and Jimmy did not fit that tone of voice. But now it wouldn't be a big deal. So he was kind of you know, um, he sounded like he sang like a blues guy, and of course, the blues songs never, charted very high, to my knowledge. Uh, so I mean, but he sang and he sounded like a blues guy. So, but I think he's an underrated singer. And he just sang with passion. I mean, when all along the Watchtower and Hey Joe. I mean, you feel what he's going, what he's trying to convey in those songs. So Jimmy's considered the greatest guitarist of all time, and well, why is that? Well, his contemporaries. I mean, he came up, and they all publicly came out and said, he's the greatest of all time. Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, Pete Townsend, all the greats of at the time, and then Jeff. I think Jeff Beck has chimed in and said, but every list, even the great ones. I mean, even you know Eddie Van Halen, I think it kind of rivals. Is in that same ballpark with Hendrix, but he still is. He still has admiration for Jimmy. So I mean, um, one of these days I did a more academic paper on the Prince, and so I posed the question. Was Was Prince a better guitar player than Jimi Hendrix? And I ended it by just, it depends. I think Prince was a more versatile guitarist. If you go and you listen to my personal branding Prince one, which is a little under an hour, I talk about, you need 6, 7, 8 guitarists to recreate what Prince did. But the difference with Hendrix and everybody else is Hendrix did things that nobody since or before has done on the guitars. You really can't recreate Jimi Hendrix, and that's kind of like for me the gold the gold standard of greatness. Can you find somebody if you wanted to recreate that, could you? And when it comes to Hendrix, you can't recreate some of the stuff he did. It was just so Jimmy. So yeah, I mean, he's considered one of the greatest. Jimmy had two big regrets, and that is his showmanship and his flashiness. He thought overshadowed his music and his actual skill as a guitar player. Probably did, but he got very frustrated towards the end of his career because everybody's like, well, light your guitar on fire, play with your teeth. And he's like, yeah, I've done that. I just want to, play. And so that frustrated him. And the other thing that frustrated Jimmy is that he never really connected with, the black audiences and the black community. Now, it's interesting, in the 70s, funk, embraced Jimi Hendrix. I mean, Sly came up, and Jimmy was a huge, 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 huge influence on George Clinton and P Funk and Bootsy, and obviously, you got I think Ernie Isley, is the Isley brother who plays guitar. If I got that wrong, I apologize. But great guitarist, he learned under when Jimmy played with the Isley brothers. I mean, he sat at and he learned his playing from Hendrix, and so Jimmy is very steeped in the funk, and it's interesting. He could never you know sync up, so to speak, with black audiences. But but when you're that good, folks are going to figure out how to sync up with you. So yeah, but as I was saying earlier, so I mean, you got two. I mean, I still at least going to by the end of grunge. I'm not too much into the new metal and rock scene, but you have kind of. Um, Hendrix here, and in this wing, and then well, let's put it, Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen over, in the same wing, doing different things. I mean, really, in many ways, Eddie Van Halen comes out of the Chuck Berry school. He's a very fast fingers, and even though distorted, his stuff is he really he has a clean sound, and Jimmy was pure blues, and often dirty, and sometimes, I mean, go listen to the Maui concert that came out a few years ago, and it's just like Jimmy's trying to tame the Kraken. I mean, it's almost like he literally has the gain or the volume turned up so loud, and he's trying to. It's almost like he's in a rodeo, and he's just trying to keep the guitar tone and everything under control. And he seems to have loved that concert. Playing on the edge where things are shit's about to go wrong, sound wise, and he didn't always do that, but he was there. So I mean, you got Eddie and Hendrix here, and then on the other end, if you have you, runs and dirty and just that kind of sound those two had, and then over here on the other end you got David Gilmour of Pink Floyd, which had that really bluesy, emotive, but slower tempo. Taking his time. Drawing the notes out, and then kind of in the middle, you got Eric Clapton who draws from both schools. So I literally just paused, the recording here because I had an idea. Because Jimmy's family, and right now it's his half sister running the estate. And she met Jimmy twice. She's a lot younger than Jimmy. Jimmy was very close to one of his brothers. His father actually controlled the estate for a long time, and then his father passed, and so his half sister, who came into the family by marriage, and Jimmy's dad basically, had her take over when he started getting in failing to health. And I think Jimmy's younger brother, who Jimmy was very close to, uh, might be still alive. I know there were some legal battles, so he ended up getting some of the money. And it was pretty tragic because I forget how, uh, Jimmy and one of his brothers, and if you go watch, some of these documentaries, his brothers are in there. But um, so Jimmy's dad kept Jimmy and his one brother who he was close to in the family, and a couple other siblings he gave him, over to the state for adoption. So just think of how what that does. And I don't know, I've never, in all the books and all the documentaries, I'm not sure, whatever happened to those other siblings. But what I'm getting at is, so I looked at the Forbes, the top earning deceased celebrities, and it's sports, Hollywood types, and so Jimmy didn't crack that, which I'm a little surprised. I think his estate. Obviously, there's I think about three or four albums worth of unreleased studio tracks over the years, but a lot of live stuff and a lot of good live stuff. But they've done an exceptionally well job. The estate with the name, image, and likeness of Jimmy, because I have a whole stack of Jimi Hendrix T-shirts, and interestingly enough, I think they've done better with name, image, and likeness than, say, surprisingly, but the John and Yoko was sort of the when John and Yoko got married, she became sort of the business, and for whatever reason, Yoko hasn't really run with the name, image, and likeness of John as the Hendrix family has. But I think overall, um, you know, the Hendrix estate, I have to put them in the top 10 of how they've managed, the affairs there, the unreleased music and name, image, and likeness. He stayed at that level of legendary status. And I know, going back to our good friend Rick Beato, I know when he was talking about, would Hendrix be, if he came up today, would he be a star? I know he pulled up Spotify and he was like, well, Jimmy's, streams aren't, you know, they're average at best. And yeah, but, Hendrix is Hendrix. I mean, he's still, and it's interesting. I don't. I'm still trying to get a handle on the falling off of the guitar and popular music. I think a lot of it has to do is with hip hop never really embracing the guitar. A lot of reasons for that. I mean, hip hop and punk, and I'll get on to do on all things music on punk eventually. But there's a lot of borrowing from punk and hip hop, um, in some ways they come look, punk did not come from the suburbs. It came from the streets. It came the working class kids of London. And really, if you want to trace it back, I mean, people talk about the Sex Pistols and the Ramones, but it really comes out of gritty Detroit in the late 60s and early 70s. I mean, with MC5 and the later Stooges stuff. So, in many ways, hip hop did not come from, Howard University or, the black elite. It came from the streets. And so, and in hip hop's case, it's interesting because, early on, punk was not, known for playing, you didn't have to play really well. And you know, hip hop started with DJs playing records and finding a good groove and folks, rapping over the record. So literally, I mean, it didn't even start in the studio. It happened on stage, like, and punk happened on stage with, dudes who could, only knew three chords on the guitar and knew, four notes on the bass and, sort of knew how to beat on a drum. That's, so so hip hop and punk share that, and just because the economic aspects of the mothers and fathers of hip hop, they never embraced the guitar. I mean, first of all, if you're spinning a record and rapping over it, you don't need a guitar. And then I don't know how much money they spend studio time they spend on Rapper's Delight or you know Planet Rock, Africa Bambaataa, or The Message by the Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. But you know, and they were singles. They weren't doing albums. So I mean, money was an issue in hip hop back then, and they just never really got around to you know Run DMC did a little bit, and then they brought in Joe Perry and Aerosmith, when they did Walk This Way. But so I think that's part of it. And but the interesting thing, going back to the guitar, is that during the lockdown, during the pandemic, guitar sales soared. So I don't know. It's an interesting phenomenon. The lack of guitar in music. It's there. It's interesting. But hey, I did a little side show and took some side roads. But I mean, we're talking about Jimi Hendrix, the greatest guitarist of all time. Hey, what do you expect? So Jimi Hendrix, the brand. I mean, he's the innovator. Where does hard rock and heavy metal come from? I mean, it's uh, kind of starts with Hendrix. I mean, you had some other. I mean, you had In Gagata De Vita by Iron Butterfly that came out about the same time. I mean, Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles was pretty heavy. I mean, um, I think Paul McCartney had his ear to the street and wanted to do some heavier stuff. So post Sergeant Pepper, Helter Skelter on the White Album. But I mean, Hendrix, in his live stuff. I mean, he was Sabbath before Sabbath. So I mean, he really is. He's the godfather of hard rock. I mean, he's the first. Those songs I just named and Hendrix, and I gotta wonder what the members of Black Sabbath thought the first time they heard "Painted Black" by the Rolling Stones, because that's a whole different matter of fact in classic songs. I mean, I didn't. That's that. I think that is on the list, but I'm definitely doing that one. A whole lyrically and everything else, and just the tone of the song. No song had ever sounded like that since. When you hear Sabbath, it's they're kind of that sound and that dark, heavy sound. I mean, they're kind of like the children, the spawn of Paint It Black by the Stones. But that's for another conversation, another episode. So yeah, Hendrix is an innovator. Um, he certainly had style. You know, he's not the first flashy performer. I mean, go back and look at Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard. On the keys, even before, even more flamboyant than Elton John. I mean, Elton John was pretty, but I mean, they would twist and play the piano behind their back, and just the energy they brought to their playing. Um, and then obviously, Jackie Wilson and James Brown bringing the dance aspect. But he was the first guitar. Well, I mean, look, he wasn't the first guitarist to play with his teeth. That he learned that on the blues, the Chitlin circuit, and they were But hey, give him credit. I mean, it took a lot of time and effort to learn all the tricks of his playing. Um, so I mean, yeah, innovator, showman, um, that's his brand, but underrated songwriter, underrated lyricist, underrated singer. I mean, Jimmy, you know, lots of folks have covered his songs too. And there's a little bit of Jimmy in pretty much every most guitarists out there. Um, so yeah, um, this is a fun episode. One of my top five, personal, influences. Um, so subscribe to the channel, hit that like button. I got my four albums working on number five, but hey, they're here on the channel. They're on the streaming services, and as I say, every episode I got my two science fiction fantasy novels on Amazon and that novella. So hey, hit the like button, listen to more stuff. I appreciate your support, and see you next episode.